I think we are there. Okay, so
Great.
Angela, hello. It's really, really nice to
Hi.
speak with you. I know it's very early in the morning in Hong Kong, but I mean, I have a lot of things to tell you about how touching and how revealing Cosmic Call has been for both me and other people. Have seen it in the MOAC Museum and in amongst our audiences, and of course it has to do with how poignant your essay and fiction about outbreak narratives becomes today that we are in this pandemia. It acquired a feeling of being prophetic and also pointing to a very significant number of issues that we need to start thinking just to be able to live through what we are experiencing. How do you see at this piece from today? I mean, you must have an odd feeling about it also.
It's very timely. Oh, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me, and then I'm really glad to be here. Actually, I think it's just pure luck that Welcome commissioned the piece. And today when I look at it, for some people it feels prophetic, but as I mentioned before, you can only say it in hindsight. Because if nothing happens today, it will be like people would just look at it, oh, it's a great piece of storytelling, and that's about it. People won't really go into detail thinking about what it really means by the outbreak narrative or anything. Even at that time when I was like composing that piece, I was thinking, how do I make it relevant? Because after SARS, after like 10 years after SARS, and it never came back, everybody feels a bit complacent. So how to trigger people's imagination and curiosity, I think that's the biggest challenge.
I was directed to see your work by Inti Guerrero, our Colombian curator friend, and he basically said, "You need to see that work. Is gorgeous." That was the way he introduced me to the piece. But I also know that there's a reason why he was snared with it, and it has to do also with the way in which Cosmin Costinas and him had curated their own exhibition about epidemics, the year of the plague. So this is something that has to do with the Hong Kong experience. I somehow have learned through them and through you that there's a way in which the identity of Hong Kong and the view of its history is not only linked with the experience of colonization and devolution and the conflict about the ruling of the Chinese government, but it's also traversed by the history of epidemics. Is this the reason why you were asked to do the piece? It came with the commission of thinking back about the history of epidemics in Hong Kong, or it was how was it that you were chosen? Who's the curator? How that started?
Well, they don't have the curator. Actually, it was Ken Arnold. He came to Hong Kong and started to speak to people, like an artist recommendation. It's actually Contagious City is a multi-city project. So it started with Hong Kong, New York, and Geneva. And the reason why, and Berlin later on, and the reason why they picked these cities, I think it's because of, first of all, WHO is in Geneva, and that's why. And in New York is a long history of epidemics as well, the AIDS crisis and different things. And Hong Kong, of course, it has a long history of, the bubonic plague in the 1800s, and then the Hong Kong flu in the 1960s, and then, of course, SARS. And especially SARS, I think the Hong Kong experience is very important for the project. It has like a huge impact on Hong Kong people. Without that particular experience, I don't think we can handle it as well today for COVID-19 because everybody is very conscious about wearing masks. And it's something that haunted us, since 2003, because like nobody expected something to happen like that. Basically, if I can go back to talk about SARS, it started in a very similar situation. I think we heard about there's something going on in China back in February in 2003 or earlier. And there were a lot of rumors, and like relatives, like people and friends are talking between like Hong Kong and China, saying that there's something, something's not right here. And then people started a bit panicky in Hong Kong. So they were like panic buying vinegar. It's very strange. Like there's a lot of rumors around that vinegar can kill germs. So, and then it all started like that. So for COVID-19, it's also like, we heard there's something going on in China and people already got like a bit nervous. And then people are buying masks and then, just be more well prepared. But again, like in all countries, in the beginning, there was a huge shortage of masks in January and February. And then with that experience the experience of the protests in 2019, we learned to not trust what the media is telling us. We learned not to trust the government, not to trust China or even the WHO. And that's why people started, buying machines to manufacture masks ourselves. And we have like a community distribution of masks to the underprivileged, to the poor people, and to medical workers as well. So and we're very glad to have like Hong Kongers who are living in the States, for example, to send us like boxes and boxes for masks for hospital workers and the underprivileged. So it's just like the spirit of people, like in solidarity, coming together to help each other out instead of relying on the authority. I think this is what we learned from SARS and also what we learned from the movement in 2019.
It's the Hong Kong spirit in many ways. At the same time, I need to tell you that you touched on two very central questions of your artwork. One is, how can we learn from history being such a foreign country, such a muddy place, such a confusing space? And the other part is precisely what's the authority of narrative? What is the value of hearing about something? You described that a major element in this work has been to read Priscilla Wald's book on contagious cultures carriers and the outbreak narrative from 2008. How did you come across that book? It's very specialized. I mean, it's proper scholarship.
Yeah, it's a really impressive book. I came across it in just in the library. Well, I'm supposed to do research in the Museum of Medical Science in Hong Kong, but then I move on to go to the Central Library and just like educate myself with like something that I'm interested in. And also, I know there's a lot of information around. So I just started like picking up books. Like the first book that I read was Plagues and People by William McNeill. That was an interesting book too. And then there's another book about public health policy in Hong Kong, starting from the 1800s, how the colonial government was handling epidemic crisis in Hong Kong. And then the book that I mentioned, Priscilla Wald's Contagious Outbreak Narrative. So I don't know, it's just the point after reading that book, I found that, oh, okay, this is the way to do it. Because it's a narrative, because I like narrative, I like storytelling. And I will be probably invent an alternative narrative where I can plug in different information. It's the way to package the different, like vast, seemingly unrelated information into a piece of work. And of course, the idea of outbreak narrative, or even simply the narrative itself of an epidemic, it's very important. Especially, for example, I think everybody would be aware now, like for COVID-19, how the WHO, what the WHO tells us would affect our course of action. You know, for example, they say, oh, okay, the epidemic in China has been handled successfully. There's nothing to worry about. That was like way back in the beginning. And then they're saying, oh, there's no need to wear a mask. There's not proven, like not clinically like effective in preventing the epidemics. So like this kind of like suspicious or dubious narrative really affect our survival rates. And also there's a book, I forgot when it was published. It's about the different narrative from different countries, how they handle SARS. So it was a comparative studies between Hong Kong, Singapore, China, and Taiwan. And for China, the kind of narrative they have is like patriotic, like everybody in the country coming together, sacrificing themselves. Like the individual is not important, it's for the greater good. It's a very like communist kind of rhetoric, very patriotic. But then they're very successful in, you know, calming things down. First of all, because of the narrative, and second of all, because of the draconian measures that they imposed on the citizen. So, so I think this is like really fascinating. And then, of course, according to Priscilla Wald, the outbreak narrative that she coined, it's a very specific formula. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yes,
formula?
please, go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so it's a very specific formula. It's almost like a detective story that's commonly used in films and novels and even scientific journal. So the narrative goes like that. There's a mysterious disease that emerges in a third world country, like China or Africa. And then international cooperation, and then like a scientist would come up with a vaccine, and then everything will be calmed down, and then eventually like science triumphs over everything. So it's a plot. For example, when you look at the Steven Soderbergh film Contagion, you see that kind of formula. And the 1993 film Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman is the exact same kind of formula. So the problem with this formula is it's not incorrect. SARS also fell into this kind of formula. I mean, it's honestly describing what's happening, but then it also simplifies everything. It fails to convey the complexities behind an epidemic, and people has the false impression that, okay, epidemics like germs, virus stems from these dirty countries. So it kind of fuel like a racist response to different cultures and people or countries or different locales. So that's the potential danger, one of the potential danger of this kind of narrative. And also a lot of war metaphors are also used in the outbreak narrative. For example, together we fight the virus. This is what we're using today in Hong Kong. And back in SARS, there's a slogan that says war on SARS. It's very commonly used. And because of this kind of metaphor, it's very easy to legitimize the militarization of medicine. For example, I think it's in 2014, both the US and China sent in troops to West Africa to fight Ebola. And China even sent in doctors of Chinese medicine to West Africa. And then for me, and then the WHO announced a national Ebola as a national security all over the world. So it kind of legitimizes these powerful countries to send in troops. It's like terror management. You know, once the military is there, you know, it's terror, it's terrorists or whatever, the military force might never leave. So it's very tricky. And also, the other thing about militarization is that, you know, how the police nowadays, like in Hong Kong or the US, the police are exactly the same as military. And it's very easy for them to clamp down on protests or whatever kind of political dissident gathering, because in the name of controlling the epidemics.
Absolutely.
So Right. So I think this is another danger of having that kind of war metaphor in the outbreak narrative. And there are like different kinds of things. For example, it legitimizes the infinite expansion of science, medical science, and it legitimizes surveillance. So it makes people like people would think about like how much information should I surrender to the authority for the sake of public health. And this is a very important point that Yuval Harari talked about. Like he talked about under the skin surveillance, like in the very near future, like our pulse, our temperature, like how our body functions in the most minute detail will be made available to the authorities. So, okay, it's good in tracking down the disease, but then with this kind of information, the government would have more control over, or biopolitical control over the population. So I think, like all in all, the outbreak narrative would bring out these questions. So that's why I'm interested in that. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
No, I think it's actually not only clarifying, but illuminating in many ways. I guess one part of it has to do with the difficulty we have in actually distancing ourselves from the plot. There's an obsession in today's culture about denouncing conspiracy theories, but there's very little sophistication in relation to handling these templates that structure, as you clearly indicated, not only the tale, but the experience and the strategies and the policies that they are actually framed already the moment we start to try to tell the story and we narrate it in our actions. I was thinking back on one element of your piece, which is that somehow, maybe I'm wrong, but I interpret that you tried to introduce an element of alienation, of distancing, by creating a narrative that revolves around the theories of Chandra Vikramanjin. I don't know if that's the way you pronounce it properly.
Sorry, it was sorry?
Chandra
okay,
Vikramanjin. That is an important scientist in having very obsessively proposed the theory of panspermia, the idea that the world has been inhabited from outer space. But I was not aware that also included an argument about viruses and bacteria coming out of space. So the moment you start your piece, you bring a narrative that is at the same time incredibly seductive and also difficult to believe, that puts you in a very uncertain place that is as annoying, because it's a narrative based on research, and at the same time it brings distrust. It's also very deliberate that you adopt documentary style, that you the first part of the video is basically not only research based, but it has a research rhetoric. So all those decisions, can you comment on a little bit on them?
It's funny that you mentioned that. It started out sort of like a conspiracy theory or a pseudoscience, but then Chandra Wickersham is a proper, well-respected scientist together with Fred Hoyle. And then also like renowned scientists such as Carl Sagan also mentioned about panspermia, and then with Francis Crick as well. So I think the interesting about science is that a lot of things started out as not pseudoscience. How would I phrase it? For example, bacteriology. When it first started, people didn't believe in it because people cannot see the germ. So it sounds like something hocus pocus. So what's the fine line between magic and science? And sometimes like there are a lot of crossovers. Like I remember there's a scientist, and people believed in the idea of miasma. You know, it's the air that around you that makes you sick, but they don't know there's
Mhm.
Exactly. And when people talk about the cholera germs, I think it's a bacteria, right? I think there's a scientist that proves that bacteria doesn't exist. So he started like in the public drinking a glass of contaminated water just to prove that there's nothing in this water. I mean, this is the germs is in the air, it's not in the water, something like that. You might like, I probably have to research more about it because I'm just like trying to recall what I read for a long time. So anyway, I think my point is there's just like there's a fine line between magic and science, superstitions and science, and science is also very ritualistic, and how doctors like perform in the theater, and magic is also like the shaman, you know, a healer. It's also very ritualistic. So I'm interested in this kind of crossovers. So whether something is pseudoscience, would it become a proper science? Would it become a proper discipline in like 100 years? We don't know. Maybe there's some truth in panspermia. We don't know. And there's a famous saying, it's the, what is it? The absence of evidence is not, doesn't equal the evidence of absence. Something like that. Okay, I think it's the absence of evidence doesn't equal, yeah. So something that you cannot prove doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
Yeah, right.
You made me think a lot on an issue that obsessed me when I was a BA student in history. It was the time when precisely the postmodern awareness of narratives became very central, when Hayden White showed historians that they had tropes, that their science was literary. And that was shocking in many ways. But one thing that I remember very clearly was the feeling you had that the only difference between history and stories was that history had to be truthful. It was not truthful.
Yeah.
It didn't create the feeling of disbelief of fiction. But by listening to you and looking at your piece, it occurred to me that in reality, science operates in the opposite way. That is something unbelievable that is being demonstrated true. That as you say, precisely the condition of contemporary science is that evidence is not available empirically in terms of daily life. That and that produces a political gap where deniers and right-wing conspiracies appear. But it's also something that has to do with the complexity of establishing the scientific narrative. I mean, you spoke about Sagan. He's corny, but he really was a great storyteller. He was making his points in ways that were not demonstrative, but narrative. And I think that the quality of that condition is something that your piece captures very well. But there's a moment when you actually seem to say that this path of narrative is not going to work, and then you decide to get into this futuristic performance, the paradox of yourself. Somehow I felt that it had to do with the feeling that the end of the narrative was not available, and you decided to invent a new myth. How did you arrive to that conclusion? It's very effective, it's striking, it's beautiful, but it's also something that in retrospect is very surprising.
Well, I guess it's because there's so many different contradictions around the discussion of epidemics. For example, like I said, surveillance. How much do we surrender ourselves to the government? And for example, the idea of vaccines. Is it good for the body or not? I mean, but if I mean, it only works when everybody get vaccinated, is the idea of herd immunity. So, but it also has a lot of side effects as well. So what do we do? And it seems like for me, it's impossible to come up with a solution about how to deal with medicine, how to deal with all of these like contradictions. So I guess my way is to turn myself into a virus. Like, sorry, it's like a conceptually, it's conceptual, it's art. I mean, it doesn't have to be a real solution, because nobody can be like bold enough to say, oh, I have the answer to everything. It's impossible. So I thought about, just do something crazy and be the virus and be just one with the universe, something like that. I don't know how I came up with the idea, but at that time it seems like maybe it's escapist in a way.
But it's also theological. Even worse is there the raising of a new goddess somehow. Let me tell you that there's something that is extremely illuminating that I never had thought about, and it's precisely the political argument about Chinese medicine. Very, very economically, I would say, in a few lines, you sketch a frightening situation that the way the current Chinese regime, his project in rehabilitating ancient Chinese thought and appropriating it for the Communist Party, is actually transforming Chinese medicine into a commodity and into an industrial product, and all that is extremely interesting and a really, really significant issue. How do you came to think on that? Because I really would say that is one of the most productive elements in your piece, intellectually and also politically.
Actually, when I started chatting with the researcher in the Museum of Medical Science, and then we started like randomly talking about Chinese medicine, and I raised this question. Okay, like Chinese medicine, like in Hong Kong, like a lot of people, like half of the population would like at least once in their lifetime consult a Chinese medicine practitioner. And it's a very common practice here in Hong Kong and in Asia. And I'm thinking, so how come Chinese medicine is not effective against epidemics? If it's not effective, like there will be no more Chinese in the world, right? So what's wrong with Chinese medicine? How come it doesn't work nowadays? So that's how I started researching into Chinese medicine. And my answer would be, since it's a very old kind of traditional knowledge, and with the rapid urbanization, and with how population, like migration, mobility of different people, of population, it's very difficult for this kind of medicine to catch up with the speed of development in society. And that's how it sort of doesn't work. At Western medicine with antibiotics, it's magic. It works right away. But Chinese medicine is very slow process. So I started talking to different Chinese medicine practitioners in Hong Kong. And they told me like really, really interesting, like what I mentioned in the video. Actually, I think very few people know about it unless you study Chinese medicine, is that TCM, traditional Chinese medicine in capital letters, is very different from what we have in Hong Kong. TCM in China, TCM doctors in China, they can perform surgeries, they can prescribe antibiotics, but they also have to study traditional Chinese medicine. But nowadays, most of them would choose to prescribe Western medicine because it's faster, it's more cost effective. So that kind of individualized treatment, individualized medicine, it's it's gonna die out maybe sooner or later. I don't know. And the development of Chinese medicine since the Chinese Communist Party came into power, I read the piece of history from the book, from different literatures, and how it's appropriate to fit the revolutionary ideal. It's super interesting. Like I mentioned in the interview, like in the old days, acupuncture lines was like really fluid, and it's like an artist's rendition of the human body. But during the Civil War, these lines are like all in straight line, and all the acupuncture points were lined up as if they're on the front line in the battle. So, and then after the Civil War is over, this kind of rhetoric, this kind of metaphor died together with the Civil War. And then Mao decided, oh, I want China to be perceived as a modernized country, and we want to standardize and universalize Chinese medicine. And that's why this kind of war metaphor for the human body was like over, no more. And then it moves into, the scientification of Chinese medicine. And also, if you look at like from 4,000 years ago, Chinese medicine at that time, like for example, in the Shang Dynasty or the Han Dynasty, it would be very different from the Chinese medicine before the CCP took over, because like each province, each region would have local knowledge. And whenever an emperor come into power, of course, they would wipe out certain languages or certain knowledge from a province, which a lot of dissident voices. This is pretty common everywhere in the world. I mean, that's how you wipe out certain cultures in a way. So that's how like Chinese medicine evolved. It's very complex. I don't claim I understand everything, but if people are interested, it's really, really illuminating.
Well, thank you. I really need to tell you, it's been a great journey to work with you, and I learned so many things. But besides that, I'm amazed on how this piece brings all these different threads together. And somehow I need to tell you that it probably restores the organic feeling of those acupuncture lines.
Yeah, it's kind of restored, but in a different way. If you want like real Chinese medicine, you come to Hong Kong.
I will. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bye.